Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to have a bit of a creative panel solution. I think the ASA staff has been doing a great job, but I don't know if you guys saw Biden's global summit. There were a lot of tech problems, and so I think that if Biden can have some issues, so can we. So thanks everybody for being patient. And part of our tech issue today is that Pavel Pachta finds himself in an airport and cannot join by laptop, and so he's on the phone. So I have him on my phone, and we're going to actually start the panel, mix it up a little bit by hearing just a bit of an update from Pavel about what's been happening with the scheduling and the impact, and a little bit of information about some of those policies. And then we're going to let him catch a flight. And then Max and I are going to have more of a dialogue about how this impacts the work we're doing in Canada, in the US, and just how we're seeing it impact other work in other countries. Does that sound good, Max? Okay. All right, Pavel, welcome by WhatsApp, and you are now live at the ASA Unity Conference. It's so good to hear your voice, and hopefully next year I will see you in person. But it seems like over the years when we've had you speak at the ASA conference, it's always been sort of this long off dream that we would ever affect UN policy. And so it is very exciting for me to introduce you to our conference after something very positive has happened. So why don't you tell our attendees what's happened this last year with WHO and the UN?
Okay, so Steph, thank you very much. And, I'm greeting everybody, and I'm really sorry that we have to go through WhatsApp, but I hope you can hear me, and if necessary, I can shout.
No, you're doing great. No need to shout. We can hear you fine.
It's sufficient. Okay, it's sufficient. So, thank you, Steph. You have asked me the question about what has happened in the international drug control. For all this utilization of cannabis, there is one framework, and this is the fact that cannabis is controlled as a narcotic drug under the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, and almost all countries around the world are parties to the treaty. So from the beginning of the existence of that convention, cannabis is under control. It's included in Schedule 1 of the treaty, and such drugs should be used for medical purposes, but drugs in general, narcotic drugs, should not be used for non-medical purposes, but may be used for medical purposes. But there is a small subgroup of drugs, and these are those which are included in the so-called Schedule 4 of the 61 Convention. And what has been happening since 1961, that cannabis was included there, and these are drugs which are considered extremely dangerous and with no medical usefulness. So extremely dangerous drugs and with no medical usefulness, and these are drugs in Schedule 4, and governments are invited to enforce the most strict control measures for these substances, and even to consider their prohibition. And this is what has even happened with cannabis, that it has been prohibited even for medical use in almost all countries around the world. So if patients knew that cannabis is helping them and so on, and then all this process started, 1996, California, and then Israel, and then Canada, and then Netherlands. And so the advocates like ACA, like Steph Sherer, they were trying to persuade the international community, take this cannabis out of this Schedule 4, doesn't belong there. And it's a process which is possible. It has two steps. First of all, the World Health Organization has to establish an estimate of the substance and has to make a proposal, for example, to take the substance out of Schedule 4. And the second stage is that then governments represented in the so-called Commission on Narcotic Drugs are voting on that recommendation of WHO and are either saying yes or no. So for years, ASA was trying, and I remember that very, very well, was trying to persuade WHO to go into that and to make a new review of, the substance of cannabis. I remember 2016, a substantive document, really a large document, was prepared by ASA, sent to Vienna, where the commission is dealing, and to Geneva, where the WHO is located. And I remember your president writing letters to the Director General of WHO, etc. They agreed in 2016. So after all this pressure, they agreed to look into cannabis, and it took them 2 years. And in 2018, they finalized their job, and early 2019, they sent a letter to the United Nations proposing to take cannabis from the Scale 4. In a way, in 2019, governments were still quite hesitating, and should we do it, should we not do it? They moved that decision, but the decision finally was taken on the 2nd of December 2020. 2nd December 2020, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations was voting on the recommendation of the WHO, and the Commission decided by a very slim margin, 27 votes for deletion of cannabis, 1 abstention, 25 against deletion of cannabis. So it was extremely a slim decision, 27 to 25, 1 abstention, but they decided to delete cannabis from this Scale 4. So it means it's not anymore considered as a very dangerous substance with no medical use. So if you ask me, and Steph has asked me, what does it mean? Well, it's a bit kind of symbolic. The decision, but it's also taking from cannabis this stigma of a drug which is very dangerous and which has no medical use. And then practically it may have good consequences, and it will have good consequences, because many governments are more or less mirroring the scheduling framework of the International Drug Control Treaty. So countries which in the past prohibited the use of cannabis for medical purposes, they were now informed no cannabis can be used as any other drug for medical purposes. And we hope that additional countries will join, and we hope that also, for example, your country will now establish federal legislation regarding the United States regarding medical use of cannabis. So all that is on the way. We hope that medical use will increase, and we also hope that that research will increase. In the past it was said prohibit the use of cannabis even for medical, except for very limited scientific research under government control. Now it is a normal drug, so it should be used for medical purposes. Governments should ensure its availability for medical purposes, and in addition, it should be available for research. So it is not only a big, symbolic, exciting change in the international drug control with respect to cannabis, but it has also some practical consequences. I tried. Sure, Steph, to give you an answer.
No, that's it. That was very comprehensive. Thank you so much, Pavel. And before we let you go, catch your flight, I just want to ask you one more question, and that is just recently the International Narcotics Control Board, which is basically the global DEA, but without guns. They made a recommendation to the UN about how to move forward with medical cannabis. And I'm just wondering if you can tell me, one, what sort of weight do they hold with the UN as far as the member states adopting these policies? And what do you think of their comments?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think INCB is considered as a so-called watchdog of the International Drug Control Treaty. So this is a independent body of experts elected by the Economic and Social Council of UN, and this independent expert should serve as a quasi-judicial body. So they should see how governments are implementing the treaties. They are not establishing the treaties. They are not a parliament. They are a judicial body. So they are only following what the treaty says and whether it is properly implemented by governments. That means for INCB in the past, cannabis was a drug in Schedule 1 and in Schedule 4 of the 61 Convention, a drug which is very dangerous and which is considered not to have medical usefulness. Now it has changed. Cannabis is a drug or still a narcotic drug. It should not be used for non-medical purposes, but all governments should ensure now its availability for legitimate medical use. Yeah. So this is a major change. So this watchdog changes somewhat from somebody opposing the use of cannabis or warning before this use. But now you have the watchdog who is telling you, no, you governments, you placed it in Schedule 1 of the 1961 Convention, and as we are encouraging you to ensure availability of narcotic drugs for the treatment of pain, now it is our duty of INCB to remind you that you should also ensure the availability of this substance, of this drug, for medical purposes. So what they do is that they started the process of developing kind of guidelines, which they should prepare for governments, and in close cooperation with governments, in close cooperation with international experts, which would enable countries which have not yet started with medical cannabis to start with that, to start with these programs. So I think it is a very positive step that this body is now to some extent on your side, on the side. Well, it has also should have been on the side of patients and is on the side of patients and is now trying to improve the access to this narcotic drug. It is not their decision that this is a narcotic drug. This is the decision of governments which are members of the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which are parties to the 61 Convention. But now the position of the drug under the treaty has changed. So I was in one of those meetings. I think it goes very well. It's, of course, they would like to produce it as soon as possible because it's needed. And I think they are very open to comments, and they are very open to practical issues. Of course, there are still some open issues. I do not want now to go technicalities, many technicalities, but in principle, it shows that cannabis is being included in the mainstream of medical use. You know, they are treating that substance now as, for example, any other opioid used for, any other drug used for treatment of pain. So it has become part of the mainstream of medical use.
Well, thank you so much, Pavel Pachta. And just in case our members haven't seen Pavel speak before, you can go back. He spoke at several of our conferences and on webinars. So you can search his name on our website and find lots of other videos. And I also just want to say, Pavel has been a mentor of mine, helping us and our members navigate the WHO and the UN Committee on Narcotic Drugs. And this is a huge win for patients globally, and we could not have done it without you, Pavel. So I just want to say thank you so much, and I can't wait to see you in person.
It's an honor to be with you, and I wish you all a lot of success.
Thank you. Thank you, Pavel.
Success to this conference.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao. Zatem.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
It's so exciting. So, Max, I just wanted to say, a lot of people have asked me in the past why Americans for Safe Access was working on this issue at the UN. And, there were actually two reasons that we put this on our strategic plan in 2003. And that was, one, we had many politicians, federal politicians in the US were telling us that they couldn't change federal law to accept the medical use of cannabis because the U.S. was signed on to these treaties, right? They used it as an excuse that we couldn't do that. So, we went ahead and changed the treaty, got rid of that excuse. But I think what is most important and exciting for our work in the United States, but also globally, is now, every country that has signed on to these treaties, they have made a commitment. It's not just about what drugs are illegal. These drug treaties were also about ensuring that the citizens of of every country, that they are ensured access to these medications. And now that cannabis is listed with medical value, it means that countries are obligated to find a way to get medical cannabis to their citizens. So, this is definitely something that I'm hoping will help in the United States, but where it will definitely help are in countries where medical, even mentioning medical cannabis has been taboo. So, at all. So, lots of countries in the Middle East, more conservative areas in Africa, in Southern Europe and in Asia. I mean, this is going to be key, and in parts of South America. So countries where really, cannabis has held in some places the Philippines, where it's held a death penalty. This is a big deal. And so, Max, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself, and then tell us how this has impacted, or you see it impacting, the work for patients in Canada.
Yeah, so my name's Max. I've been working in the sector for quite some time, but my background's in healthcare, dealing with highly stigmatized and complicated disease states. So whether that's rare disease, diabetes, obesity. I was also a patient myself for a long period of time. So I just took over as the chair of the board of Medical Cannabis Canada, which is a national nonprofit in the Canadian market doing advocacy work. And I also founded a consulting firm with a few endocannabinoid experts, providing guidance on both public policy as well as, the nitty gritty of product development and brand strategy in the private sector. So, I think it's a really exciting time. Going back to what Dr. Pachta said, it is really a symbolic win, I would say. And like you said, it is one step towards broader access for patient communities. But I think the lesson that we know from any piece of federal legislation is that it is going to be, international legislation is it's going to be up to the member states to what discretion to which they execute on medical cannabis. And I think, we've seen already, even in the Canadian market and international markets, equality of access to medical cannabis doesn't necessarily mean equity in access.
Right.
And I think we're going to see disparities across different regions and how they roll out medical cannabis legalization. And there's going to be a need to address really situational and country specific needs, whether that's indigenous issues or, representing larger populations living with disability. I think there isn't going to be a one size fits all approach to medical legalization. And even just looking between our two countries, it's going to be a very different looking piece of federal regulation than we would see in the Canadian market. But the nice thing is that this is the kind of cadence you want in terms of policy development. You want to reduce barriers for each country to be able to move forward, their own legislation. But at the same time, there's going to be battles at each stage in each market, as you've seen from a state by state context, and as we're seeing in international markets as well.
That's interesting. I know you and I have had lots of conversations through IMCPC of looking at sort of model legislation, and it's hard to get a sense of. So, like you said, countries are so different the way they approach medicine, and so finding a cookie cutter approach is going to be challenging. But where I think countries are forced to have discussions about harmonization is when it comes to international trade. And I'm wondering, I know I've seen some trade come from. I know there's Canadian products that are being imported to Germany to that program. And I'm wondering if there are other products being imported into Canada that are entering the medical cannabis program, and if so, has that changed anything about the actual access for patients or the approach, the medical approach for doctors and patients?
Yeah, so I'm not an international trade expert, especially in terms of importation into the Canadian market. What I will say is that it's not the best place to be an importer purely because it's incredibly competitive and there's quite a large amount of product offerings. I think, especially looking at the WHO and INCB decisions, I don't think we're going to see as much of an access impact in the Canadian market. We have a statutory review of the Cannabis Act coming up next year, as well as a formal review of the medical framework years following. And, I think our own internal efforts around that piece of those reviews are going to be the most impactful from an access perspective. I think there is a lot of product and market here. The challenge is there are still serious access barriers to patients in the Canadian market, whether that be the fact that, cost is a huge burden, or going back to the issues of things like even packaging accessibility. I just wrote a piece on this recently where, when you're regulating medical cannabis under the same framework as the recreational stream, there's a lot of important efficiencies that help producers save money in terms of production and compliance. But at the same time, we're lacking the substantial exemptions needed in the Cannabis Act to allow producers to develop things like, accessible packaging. So if I'm a patient and I'm on hydromorphone, I can go into my pharmacy and ask for, packaging that's openable and not super child resistant, because let's say I'm dealing with arthritis.
So looking at, as we're developing our federal legislation, you said you guys have a review coming up this year. What are going to be some of the more important things that you are going to change?
Yeah, so, we have a lot of different priorities. We're still in consultations with our patient advisory committees as well as other nonprofit stakeholders to make sure that we're representing the actual, the needs and the desires of patients. But, a few things we're going to be looking at are really accessibility. So this is, looking at, like I said, packaging accessibility, expanding the medical exemptions to allow for licensed sellers to develop packaging that actually works for a lot of patients dealing with mobility issues or spasticity. At the same time, that's looking at THC limits, which I know is an issue we have in state-by-state legalization frameworks around medical with some limiting caps. Right now, we have per product THC limits on the amount of milligrams you can have in things like edibles. And it creates a challenge for a patient using specific dose options because, if they have a lot higher tolerance or just require a lot higher dose for their specific symptom, it's very expensive to buy a lot of those products. On expense, we're also looking at costs. So trying to include exemptions to the excise duty as well as, any other tax framework applied to cannabis. That includes on the producer side too, because actually it's interesting. If you're producing both rec and medical, the fact you participate in the medical market, you get taxed an additional % on your revenues. So it's just, we're seeing disincentivization of that market pretty consistently. And then the last is looking at access to dispensing. So, what's interesting is markets like, in Europe, as well as some state markets, have pharmacy dispensing. But in Canada, the medical access program doesn't have any dedicated brick and mortar access points. So you can only access federally directly from licensed medical sellers. There's been some amazing, kind of innovation within the confines of that framework and some interesting models. But so we're looking at things like pharmacy dispensing, and, just trying to expand access to also care from HCPs as well, because, the gap in Canada is Health Canada estimated, about 14%, I think, of our population uses cannabis for medical purposes. It's about 5 million people. But we only have 400,000 active medical documents. So that means, that's 400,000 people actually using the legal medical system. Yeah. So whatever we do, we're trying to just, find ways to not prevent access to a medical market, but ensure safe access and also equitable access, because it's clear, especially for, patients living with disability and others who are dealing with other intersectionalities that can impact their treatment, that they're the ones really getting left behind from policy.
And, we had Philippe Lucas was in the conference yesterday. Good friend, long-term friend. He actually created Canadians for Safe Access, which was the patient group that was there before yours. And obviously things evolve over time. But he was talking about insurance coverage, and I'm wondering how you guys have a much different insurance program in Canada than we do here in the United States. But how are you going to approach insurance coverage? And I'm wondering if the UN change in scheduling could help that process.
Well, so insurance coverage is interesting because, we were talking about the Cannabis Act specifically, and there's not really a mechanism to necessarily get pharmacare or private benefits coverage within the Cannabis Act. Okay. So that's an issue we are working on, just not specifically in that review. So, it's much more of a one-on-one, I'd say, kind of the behind the scenes and also more grassroots lobbying effort, because, the challenge is pharmacare is probably a far way away. It also is something that is executed by the provinces. So which is the equivalent of states in the Canadian market. So it's complicated to get national pharmacare for cannabis and it listed as a formulary. But like Philippe said, I did watch that segment. There is progress being made in private insurance benefits coverage. The last research I saw from Health Canada, I think, said around 6% of patients have full benefits coverage, where, Germany, you're looking at the majority. So, we are behind in that regard. But what it comes down to is actually something that Philippe mentioned, which is expanding almost the health economics argument of cannabis in terms of reducing use of other medications. And that's a key pillar of our messaging generally. Is we find that, regulators as well as lay audiences don't resonate as much with the argument of, oh, it's such an efficacious treatment, everyone should get access. But what does resonate is, we're in the middle of an opioid crisis, and we are seeing positive benefits in terms of opioid use dependency and being able to get patients off of highly addictive medications. So, what Philippe is doing is fantastic, because it's a huge need. And that's something we're doing as well, is we're trying to expand patient-focused research, even if we're not doing full clinicals, but looking at the impact on other drug use and trying to make that claim, whether it's to a regulator or to a private insurance coverage provider, of why there's value in providing broader access. Because also, and sorry to keep rambling on, the coverage we do have, in often cases, it's second line, third line. It's for a very limited amount of indications. So, we know about 50% of patients, depending on the research you look at, it's always a bit variable, are treating for things like chronic pain. But, you're looking at indications and benefits providers that don't always cover what the majority of patients are treating with. You're seeing, micro indications like MS, epilepsy, things that are still very important and deserve coverage. But, it's really about expanding that access to a broader patient pool.
In Holland, which was one of the first next to Israel, country-based or federally legal medical cannabis programs. They've gone on and off with insurance coverage. They have in Europe, there's a lot of state-based insurance. And what we had heard, and I would still love to use a platform like IMCPC to try to get more cooperation between countries that have medical cannabis laws for this information. But what the Dutch insurers were finding was less emergency room visits for cannabis patients, as well as a deduction in other medications as far as a cost savings. And this was before the opioid pandemic. So it was really, really interesting to think about, an insurer seeing this in their business plan. I think that's really been our approach for Americans for Safe Access, is looking at all these different stakeholders and make sure you speak their language. So, you don't go into an industry association and talk about patient needs. You go in, talk about new industries and money, and the same thing with talking to insurers, that this is not about policy, it's about saving money. And I think, one of the potential positive components looking forward to that is that, pharmaceutical companies and insurers don't necessarily always get along, and that might be where medical cannabis could be a wedge, issue. I'm wondering, as far as the Canadian regulators go and patient advocates, how much are you looking at other countries, as we now have 44 countries that have medical cannabis laws? Are you learning more as these different models are coming forward, and do you see bringing any of that into the Canadian program if you had your wish list or your success list?
Yeah, and I mean 100%. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there's not a one size fits all model, but a lot of different countries are doing really interesting things that could be adopted by some of the earlier stage players. Like, I mean, looking at Mexico, who's really investing in fostering not only local domestic production, but supporting indigenous communities that need to be a benefit of this policy. You're looking at, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of different countries are looking at ways to expand insurance coverage that we are not even close to reaching in terms of the numbers. And then you're also seeing things like, dispensing routes and better access in some occasions to HCP support. So, I think it's the same thing I hope in the US as well. Is, I think we have always been a federal system, and it's easier as an advocate, actually, because it starts at the federal level. And then there's still battles on the provincial level. Like Philippe mentioned, a 20% vaping tax in BC. I worked to try to get a bill through the legislature there, which lost, or an amendment, which lost by about a vote to try to remove that tax on the medical side. So there's still provincial arguments, but where I've been really impressed with ASA, and I think your battle is going to continue even after federal legalization, is going to be that, you started at the state level and those markets are going to maintain. And there's going to be inequities both within states and across the country, regardless of fundamental federal policies. So, I think state by state, international markets, the Canadian market, we're always going to need to learn from each other because, like I said, this is just not one size fits all, and it needs to come from the patient, from the situational context, but learning from everyone that we can.
Absolutely. I think something that is also that we've been seeing from like the German market and also some of the other European markets is standardization of product. And I think that, what's interesting, there's always been this dialogue about the US program being so amazing because there's such a diversity of products. And that's true and exciting. But I wonder if that diversity of products is there because we don't have standardized products, meaning that if there were products that you could depend on the dosage, that diversity is often because you can't find what works because you don't know what's in it, right? And so I think one of the things that we have constantly been doing at American Safe Access, we actually have at least 2 strategy meetings a year, sometimes 4, because the political landscape changes so much. And I think it's really important to always be looking at goals that you want at the federal level. And so I think really looking, something we're always talking about is that the state by state program we created was really supposed to be a pit stop until we, really moved cannabis into an acceptable medicine. But in order to do that, it wasn't just looking at the law enforcement side of things. We're actually talking about changing how we view medicine. And, it turns out that side of things is going to be a bit more complicated than navigating law enforcement and navigating sort of the legal side of things. Now we have to get into really, entrenched industry of how we talk about medicine and how we get it to people.
Well, and you make a good point because it's an issue that you're going to see in every legalized cannabis market. We're never going to, or at least not to say that this is true, but, I don't expect us seeing cannabis in its current format, getting things like a drug identification number. But I think what we need to see is that we need cannabinoid products that are distributed in a medical setting and given better access to patients. At the same time, I do see, federal legalization in the US as an amazing opportunity for clinical research leadership because, to be honest, the biggest barrier to clinical research in Canada is money. And the US has always had a much higher level of capital in terms of pharmaceutical investment. So, I think long term, this market will always be there. It'll always be incredibly important. But I also see an expansion of pharmacological cannabinoid treatments in the future, 100%, that'll probably be regulated through the FDA. That said, I would love to see, alternative dose controlled formats in the existing market find something similar. I'm just not sure, especially in the US context, and I think a previous panelist mentioned this, if the FDA would even get into that discussion. But, I think standardization is very important. Product diversity isn't a problem as long as, you've got some strong manufacturing standards. Any labeling has pretty good rigor. And in the Canadian market, we have quite strong oversight from Health Canada. And so, I think that is the benefit of federal legalization that you're going to see in the US is I think an expansion in clinical research 100%, but also, like you said, kind of a rules of the game that allow hopefully also multi-state operators to be able to, get big in a way that is effective and efficient, whereas, rather than in a way that could be challenging across these very fractured markets.
Agreed. Well, that is our panel time, Max. This was great. And for our members, may not know this, Americans for Safe Access helped start an organization called IMCPC, which is the International Medical Cannabis Patients Coalition, which is a group of medical cannabis organizations from all over the world. And we get together on a regular basis and do things like change the UN scheduling of cannabis, as well as look at model legislation. So Max, thank you so much for being on the panel, and thank you so much for your contributions to IMCPC.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I'm American as well, and I'm just so happy to see all of this progress being made both in the US and internationally. So thanks to ASA as well for all that you do and for having me.
Fantastic. All right, we're moving on to the next panel. Thanks, everyone.